Welcome back to Open to Truth, a podcast all about exploring big ideas and discovering truth together. My name's Clint.
Hey, I'm Tony. Welcome back.
We have a guest coming on the show today.
Great. A guest episode. Love these.
And her name is Dr. Janet Kellogg Ray, and she wrote this book, Baby Dinosaurs on the Ark. Just discovered this, and it's all about thinking through different forms of creationism.
Evolution.
How do different folks in those camps try to make the science fit and the Bible fit?
Yep.
Ongoing topic.
Yeah.
Within Christendom.
Are they
the
at
very
odds
least.
or not? And then, how can you be faithful to Scripture, faithful to God, and faithful to science? Can you do it all? Find out on this episode.
Right, and frankly, I'll say this later in the episode, but we just got done recording with her. But yeah, I have found myself not really feeling too confident about my factoids about evolutionary theory.
Agreed. Yeah.
It's more that my biblical interpretation has led me to a place of openness about the topic, and I never did the legwork to
figure out what might actually be true.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is a great first step. We really enjoyed our conversation with Janet, and hope you enjoy.
Yeah.
My question was more just specifically about the Cambrian part of what's in the toolkit for evolutionary theory to explain that in particular, not all of the diversity
right.
ever, just right there.
Yeah, I understand. Well, this really kind of feeds into a common misconception about the way evolution works. That, you hear the analogy of, you put a monkey with a typewriter, and what are the chances that this monkey is going to type out the complete works of Shakespeare? How could such a random process come up with the diversity that we see?
Sure, I have heard that.
Yeah. The more we know about modern genetics, the more we understand exactly what you're talking about, exactly how that could have happened. To say that evolution is just like monkeys on a typewriter is a complete misunderstanding about the very basics of evolution and how evolution works. So the first thing I would like to say just right from the beginning is that evolution does not start from scratch. So we are never starting with a blank slate when you're talking about evolution. Natural selection can only act on what is already present. So, for example, you can have mutations in specific single base pairs within a gene, or entire genes can be deleted, entire genes can be duplicated, or even expressed in a new place. And when this happens, you have a much more dramatic effect. When a gene is duplicated, it may take on a new function, or it can even amplify an existing function. And so that is how, we can see within this time frame of evolutionary history on Earth, some of these dramatic changes. In addition to genes that code for actual traits like, hair color, texture, height, those kind of things that we're familiar with, traits. The vast majority of our genes, in fact, in human beings, it's 98%. 98% of the DNA in humans does not code for anything. Instead, they are control genes. They're turning on the 2% on and off. They're delaying the timing of the expression of a gene, or they're speeding up the expression of the gene. I like this example. It's also in the book, that if you wanted to tell an orchestra that there had been a change in the program for the evening, what would you do? Would you go whisper the change to the trombone player, or would you whisper the change to the conductor if you wanted the entire orchestra to know about the change in the program? Well, of course, you would tell the change to the conductor. So we have genes throughout our genomes that are the conductors. They are control genes. And so one modification, one mutation to a control gene can have a dramatic effect. It can change the whole orchestra, so to speak. And so once we began to understand the function of control genes, it became a little more clear how something like evolution from a land mammal to a fully aquatic marine whale isn't such a stretch. And since the era of modern genetics, we are finding more and more evolution does not start from scratch. Evolution tinkers with what is already there. And evolution as a process works by just modifying, reassigning, or co-opting old genes for new purposes. And throughout life on our planet, we are finding new takes on old body plans and parts and pieces in a more primitive ancestral type animal that's doing a completely different function in a more modern, complex animal. And so that is one way, the primary way that we are looking at the diversity that we see and under the time frame, the 4 billion years or so, to get to the diversity that we have.
Right. And just to put a pin on it, it's that mutating, or just one example at least, of a mutation in a control gene. We're not talking about waiting for mutations all across this billions of sequence genome. It could be this one thing. A really compelling example, I think this is where it is in your book, in this discussion of why it is that humans can't make their own vitamin C.
Vitamin C, yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. Can you just speak to that as an example of, that's a control gene issue?
No, that is it's not a control gene issue. It's actually I think that's actually for a gene, probably for, I'm trying to recall the mechanics of that would allow us, an enzyme in a biochemical function that would allow us to produce our own vitamin C. And most mammals have that gene. We have that gene. That gene is just broken. Yes, we have it. It's just
broken.
Yeah, we just have it. It's broken, and it's also broken in the other great apes, which are closely related to us evolutionarily. And so it's not that we don't have that gene, we just carry a mutation in that gene to produce vitamin C. And so great apes, and including the humans, have to get our vitamin C from our diet. We can no longer synthesize our own vitamin C.
So, for me, the reason I found that compelling, I think, just that one was high. There's a ton of examples in the book, but that one jumped out to me because, man, if I just pull myself back again for the different views I could choose, what is a better, more likely explanation for this, that other animals that I'm related to evolutionarily have that functioning gene for whatever it is that produces the ability for me to process my own vitamin C, that God in his good pleasure decided, I don't want the great apes and human beings to have that, but all the other ones.
Turned it off, yeah.
That has to kind of be what's being said by the creationist. Or here's this other explanation where, at some point this mutation process switched it off, and that's why these guys don't have it and the rest of them do. That sounds more plausible.
And you have to go even a step beyond that from the creationist explanation, as you just put it. Not only did the creator decide that humans and the great apes did not get to synthesize their own vitamin C, but the creator or the designer inserted a broken gene that we didn't get to do, but a broken gene. Incidentally, broken in exactly the same way as the great apes, our closest genetic relatives. Yeah,
it's damning. It's damning evidence.
This talk about control genes is new to me. I have not heard that, and I'm wondering if it could be offered as a defense for one of the critiques I've heard of evolution, especially with random mutation operating sort of blindly, is just the amount of time that it would take to reach the diversity that we've reached today. Our sun would have burned out. It would take way too long if it was all random. But these control genes are almost like macro changes or shortcuts almost that change a bunch of things through one mutation, right? Am I understanding that right?
Yeah. Interestingly, we have identified the control gene for for limbs in a snake, and we have found that that control gene has been turned off.
Can we turn these back on? Is someone out there turning them back on somehow?
That gene has been inserted into the genome of a mouse, and guess what? The mouse was born without limbs.
What?
So, yeah, and embryologically, snakes have little limb buds, but that gene is turned off during embryological development, and they reabsorb. And so we can take that gene that's been turned off, we can insert it, now that we know how to do that with modern genetics, into the genome of a mouse, and the mouse will not express the growth of limbs. So
wow.
Control genes are
That's
powerful.
crazy.
Yep, they're very powerful.
I want to look at some other misconceptions of evolution, but I think we're hitting on something really important, and that's the role of prediction and expectation in our theorizing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just speak to that and like what power is harnessed by that? Because I feel like that's something that's kind of been an undercurrent of the discussion, is that evolutionary theory there's something special about it being able to predict, or that what we observe fits with what you might expect if it were true.
Well, and what you've hit on there is a foundational aspect of any science theory. A science theory has to be able to generate testable predictions. If it doesn't generate testable predictions, it is not science. It's not a science theory. So, for example, when Neil Shubin, who was interested back in the late 1900s, the late 1990s, early 2000s, when Neil Shubin was interested in documenting that transition from water to land, he knew where the first fish appear in the fossil record. And Shubin knew where the first tetrapods or four-limbed animals appear in the fossil record. And so evolution theory led him to predict, if I were to find an animal in transition between fully aquatic and fully land, I would look in this particular rock formation. And so he didn't just go traveling anywhere in the world where he could get a good airline ticket. He had to find exposed rocks of the right age, and he found Tiktaalik. Without evolution theory, he would not have been able to make that prediction.
Let us know what that is. What's Tiktaalik?
What is
Tiktaalik?
Tiktaalik is it's considered one of our premier transitionals. It was found by Dr. Neil Shubin around 2005 in the Canadian Arctic. Tiktaalik was a fish. It had gills, it had scales, but it also had the flat head of a crocodile, like we see in a crocodile or a frog. It had a flat head, but most interestingly, when they got the entire fossil, released from the rock, they found that the front limbs of Tiktaalik had the one bone, two bone architectural structure that we have in our bone, one bone, two bones. Tiktaalik had the beginnings of a wrist, also had the little wrist bones down there. Tiktaalik also had a shoulder and a neck. Now, Tiktaalik was not fully adapted to land, but Tiktaalik had an advantage over other fish in that it could push itself up on those primitive forelimbs and look around and look for either prey or something trying to eat it. So Tiktaalik is a beautiful transition, shows us the trajectory that occurred between fully aquatic and land animals. And so it was the theory of evolution that allowed Dr. Shubin to predict where he should go looking for such a transitional. Something else happened in the study of whale evolution. We had known just from the fossil record for a long time that whales evolved from land animals, and whales through control genes, mutations, went back to a fully aquatic. They kind of went full circle and went back to the sea. We knew this because there is a unique ear structure in the skull of a whale. Only whales have this unique ear structure. It's what allows them to be able to hear so well underwater. Well, as the fossil record became more complete, we began to find these animals that were obviously tetrapods, land animals, but in their skulls, they had this unique ear bone structure that we find in modern whales. Well, the puzzling situation was that with genetics, we could do genetic mapping of the whales, the modern whales, and do genetic testing of the modern group of animals called the artiodactyls. These are the even-hooved animals like deer, hippopotamus, things like that, sheep. And we found that modern whales are most closely genetically related to hippopotamuses. But artiodactyls have a very unique ankle bone. It's shaped like a double pulley. And what we had never found in the fossil record was a complete ankle bone of one of these walking whales. We found bits and pieces of their hind limbs and forelimbs, but we had never found a complete ankle bone. And that was until the late 90s. And then we found multiple fossils of ancient whales that walked on four legs and had intact ankle bones. And guess what? They had that double pulley ankle. So again, evolution theory predicted that if we ever found an intact ankle bone on one of these fossilized walking whales, then we would find that double pulley structure. Evolution theory made that prediction, and it was a testable prediction. So yeah, in order for something to be a science theory, it has to be able to generate testable hypotheses.
And so, I mean, yeah, I think any intellectually honest participant in the discussion would have to concede that story is a point in favor of the view. This predictive power that you just would not expect otherwise. Like there's nothing to speak of that connection in a Genesis-based creationist account.
Yeah.
You just that
it has explanatory power. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or there's an unknown that this theory is uniquely saying, oh, I actually know what that's going to be. If you were to look for it, it'll be like that. And the creationist would be like, I don't know what the ankle is going to look like.
Yeah.
But we do. And look, there it is.
Yeah.
So that I think that's fair. Like anyone in the discussion has to say, oh man, that's powerful.
That is powerful.
That is one of the primary problems with intelligent design as a science theory, because proponents of intelligent design will say that ID is an alternative theory to evolution. They want to put ID on the same level as evolution theory, but intelligent design has no power to predict. If everything we see is a choice made by a designer, and that choice was made for a reason known only to the designer, how can we use that to predict? How can you predict anything? If you're talking about this complex eye or this complex system is a design known only in the mind of the designer, how are you going to generate a testable hypothesis from that? What is that going to lead you?
When would you be justified in inferring that something's designed? Like I do that in my life all the time. Like I think when I see trash on the side of the road, I think that it was likely the result of some kind of human interaction. And there's some creative agent at work in explaining this phenomenon. or even like the darling of the ID movement that was brought up earlier in the conversation, irreducible complexity. To me, like that is an interesting concept. That's an idea worth thinking about even as a scientist. Like, oh, that, like, great point, Dr. Behe. Like that, we would want to. I would be very curious to learn if there are instances of that in biological life. That look, if you I guess the basic idea would be, if any one part were taken away, then the structure would lose its primary function and then not be adaptively or reproductively advantageous. And so, yeah, maybe help me understand, like, those seem like worthwhile pursuits of intellectual interest, and things like I'm sure you've heard of or even seen the documentary Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. I think it came out in the 2000s with Ben Stein, and he's interviewing all the guys, and there's this it's not totally conspiracy theory, but it tiptoes in that direction of, look, this is why there's not peer-reviewed articles. The scientific establishment is just against having design and irreducible complexity language in the journals. And so I don't know. I felt persuaded at the time by that film and wondering, like, hey, like, why aren't these guys getting a seat at the table? Like, let them publish and try to put their work out there. And if it's not widely accepted by the community, then okay. I don't know. Anything about that rambling that you could help me sort out?
Well, first of all, I would just say I completely understand the attraction to intelligent design. That was part of my journey too. Reading about that, seeing if there was some credibility there. On the one hand, intelligent design does use a lot of technical, scientific language. And on one level, it feels like a science honoring way to recognize that God is the ultimate source of everything. I think that we are so conditioned as people of faith as seeing evolution as atheistic. We somehow feel like we need an asterisk on our evolution. Well, I believe in evolution, but for many of us, that asterisk is intelligent design. We just can't quite go full force evolution. But there's multiple problems with intelligent design, both from a faith perspective, theological perspective, and also from a science perspective. First of all, we've already touched on this. The broken vitamin C gene is not the only broken gene we have in our genomes. Our genomes are littered with broken genes, that we can find these same broken genes in animals that are evolutionarily closely related to us. And so we have these broken, non-functioning genes, broken in the same way in other related animals. And so you have to ask yourself, why would a designer insert a broken gene into not only our genomes, but multiple other genomes, and not just broken genes. We have genes in our genome from millennia of viral infections, viruses over the millions of years that have invaded our ancestral kin. And the viral DNA has been incorporated into our own. And so that becomes a problem if you're talking about an intentional design. I would also, I would say to that, why would a designer mimic evolution so closely? If it was truly design and not a natural process of evolution, why did the designer choose to design in such a way that looks for all the world like it evolved from common ancestry? And then from maybe more of a philosophical point of view, We always want to talk about the great and wondrous designs. Let's talk about the eye. Let's talk about a sunset. Let's talk about all the things that are wonderful on our planet and in life. But what we don't talk about are the myriad examples of bad design. For example, the human back. The human back causes more orthopedic issues for us probably than almost any other part of our body. And back problems are primarily due to the fact that we inherited our back architecture from a quadruped, from an animal that used that same architecture who walked on 4 legs. But humans, having that same back architecture, stood up and walked on 2. So that's a fascinating study that you could see all the different changes that had to occur in order to accommodate our bipedal walking. But at the same time, we brought on ourselves, a world of back pain. Here's one of my favorite biology trivial questions. Do you know what animal kills more humans in the world than any other animal every year?
The mosquito.
It's not a shark. It's, people guess sharks or rhinoceroses, but it's a mosquito. Yeah. Mosquitoes kill. And one of the greatest health problems on our planet today is malaria. Well, there is a defective version of the hemoglobin gene that if a person inherits one defective version of this hemoglobin gene, and hemoglobin, by the way, is the element in our red blood cells that allow us to carry oxygen throughout our body. So if a person inherits one mutated version of this hemoglobin gene, they still have one good version, and so they'll be able to carry their oxygen just fine. But one copy of that hemoglobin gene confers resistance to malaria. So that's a good thing, isn't it? Wonderful. What a great decision by the designer is to design this built-in malaria resistance into these people's genomes. But that resistance comes at a cost. Because the defective gene confers malaria resistance, the defective gene stays in the gene pool. And for those people unfortunate enough to inherit 2 copies of that gene, they will have...
Sickle cell anemia?
Yes, they will have sickle cell disease. They will have a debilitating and quite often fatal disease called sickle cell disease. And so, good design, bad design. And we can go throughout life, and talk about, was this a choice of a good designer? Was this the choice of a compassionate, loving designer? When you talk about things in the biological world that are either poor designs or cruel designs, you get in a little philosophical problems when you're attributing everything, in the case of most religious people, the designer is God. And then, as you mentioned, the foundation of intelligent design is this concept of irreducible complexity, where we say something is so complex, it can't have evolved because every part and piece had to have been in place all at once, or the entire structure or the entire process cannot function. And so we have this concept of irreducible complexity. It's so complex, you can't take away a single system. But the problem with that occurs when we do explain that this complex design, this complex system, this complex structure can be reduced. It used to be the bacterial flagellum, the human immune system, the blood clotting cascades were once held up by the ID proponents as irreducibly complex.
Oh, they don't do the flagellum anymore? That's the big one I learned. That's in Behe's book.
Yeah, that's in my book. Yeah. Also, yes, the flagellum, what we found is in closely related to bacteria that have these flagellum, a closely related species of bacteria is a toxic bacteria. They use this little biological syringe of sorts. You can imagine like a needle, a syringe, to inject their toxin into their host. Well, what we found out now, because of our abilities to analyze things biochemically and microscopically and genetically, is that multiple structures in that flagella are found in that non-flagellated bacteria, but the one that has the little hypodermic needle, so to speak. It's parts and pieces of it. But what's missing from the toxic bacteria is the part that makes it spin. So all you had to add over here to the flagellated bacteria is something to make it spin.
And it did something different. That's where the mistake was made. That like, look, if you take away a piece, then it won't be able to spin. Yeah, yes. But if you take it away, look, this other guy over here made it into like this little sticker weapon.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we find that all throughout biology is that parts and pieces are reused, they're repurposed, they're reorganized. There is a protein that is found in the complex human eye, in the lens. It's called crystalline. And it's found in the lens of the human eye, which has been held up, again, as irreducibly complex. Well, what we found was that crystalline, as a protein, is also produced by a kind of animal called a sea squirt. A sea squirt is one of those really interesting primitive animals that's a chordate, but it's not a vertebrate. So it's very closely related to us. It's a chordate.
What's a chordate? You said that earlier, and I pretended I knew what it meant, but I don't. What's a chordate?
Well, we all are chordates. All of us, you and I, we're all chordates. In that embryologically, we have a nerve cord that runs down our back as embryos. Now, vertebrates, that nerve cord becomes our spinal cord and our spine and bone forms around it, invertebrates. But there are simple animals that still exist that are very much like those original chordates that arose back in the Cambrian. They're called sea squirts or tunicates is the more biological name, and lancets that are little worm-like creatures. And they are living chordates, but they are not vertebrates. So what we found is in these tunicates, these sea squirts, they don't even have a head. They look, if you saw them in the wild, they look like sponges, like those really simple animal sponges. They don't have a head. They're filter feeders, but they have embryologically this nerve cord. Well, we found out, lo and behold, these chordates, these tunicates produce crystalline. So what in the world is crystalline, a protein that is necessary for the human complex eye? What is it doing being expressed by this primitive chordate that doesn't even have a head, much less an eye? Well, turns out the chordates, this tunicate is using it in almost like a gyroscope organ in its body to tell up from down. It's a gravity sensing function in the chordate. There's also a protein called cadherin that literally helps to form multicellular bodies. It's a sticky thing. It's a protein that sticks, and animals' cells can use it to stick together. And we find it only, so we thought, in multicellular animals. Well, there was a researcher who was studying one-celled organisms and called choanoflagellates, and she found these choanoflagellates produced cadherin. So her question was, what is a one-celled organism doing producing this protein that's used to form multicellular organisms, that's literally used to stick cells together? Well, what she found out was the choanoflagellates were not using it to stick to other choanoflagellates. They were using it to stick to food. that floated by.
Oh.
And so
Right.
that's what we find time and time again, that we're not finding irreducible complexity. Just like you said, a chemical, a gene, a structure can be used in another way. So if it's used in another way than the complex example that we had, like the blood clotting or the immune system, it doesn't mean it's irreducibly complex. It just means that the parts and pieces were already there in related animals and they were repurposed for whatever reason. We don't know, obviously, all the mutations that went into vertebrates beginning to express crystalline in the lens of their eye. We don't have that answer, but what we do know is that the genes for producing crystalline were in existence long before vertebrates were in existence, that the gene was already there. We know that the genes that produce flowers are older than flowering plants. There's all throughout biology, we have examples of this. So, there's lots of problems with intelligent design, either from a philosophical point of view. Why would a designer mimic evolution? We've already touched on this a bit, but intelligent design does not have the ability to predict. And you mentioned the Dover Kitzmiller trial in 2005. Interestingly, that was a 3-week trial. It was tried before a very conservative judge in a conservative court, federal court, by a judge who was appointed by George W. Bush, who was on record as saying that he would support intelligent design being taught in public schools. So this was the judge that decided the case. And in 3 weeks, the intelligent design proponents, they brought in all the big guns, they brought in all of their research. And after 3 weeks, with the ability to bring anybody up to testify, intelligent design was ruled by this judge to be without a doubt. To read his ruling is pretty eye-opening. Without a doubt, intelligent design is not science, and it has a religious basis. And so, you have to ask yourself, you mentioned that, why do these peer-reviewed scientific publications not ever have any intelligent design articles? Are they being, as the movie said, are they being, barred for whatever nefarious reasons from publishing in these journals? I say the same thing about intelligent design as I would say about young earth creationism. If there was evidence for special creation, if there was evidence for a young earth, if there was evidence for design, you would think there would be at least one non-religious person promoting that idea. You would think there'd be at least one, and there's just not. Anyone that promotes any of those ideas comes from a religious perspective. So you would think if there truly was no evidence for common ancestry, there's just no evidence for common ancestry, you would think there would be at least one non-religious person to find that evidence, to see that evidence, but there's just not. And, scientists love to prove each other wrong. The woman who won the Nobel Prize in 2019 for chemistry had to announce in 2020 that she was retracting a paper. It wasn't her Nobel paper, but Nobel Prize winner or not, people found problems in her latest paper and she had to retract it. Scientists are not hesitant to prove each other wrong. And that is, how I would respond to why we don't see intelligent design in the peer-reviewed scientific journals, because it doesn't function the way science functions. It doesn't predict new discoveries. Like evolutionary theory can predict new discoveries. Intelligent design, by its very nature, can't predict new discoveries. It's almost like a retrospective, that we're looking at these things, they're so complex, they couldn't have evolved, they had to be designed. Okay, so what does that predict? What does that help us find? What new discoveries can we find because of intelligent design theory?
So maybe one more big topic before we start to wrap up, and that's there's just so much we could dive into in specifics, but just for the sake of time, what about someone who would say like, all right, Janet, I concede everything having to do with animals and fish and lizards and all that. They all evolved, and everything you're saying, and Tiktaalik and whatever half land whale, whatever you're talking about, fine. All of that happened. But look, humans are special. I was created in the image of God. I bear some kind of special status above all these critters. And so at the very least, like, God had his handiwork, his fingerprint is on whatever it is that I am. It's a soul, or if it's merely just my Homo sapien makeup, my genetic code, something about that can't be the result of this cold, brutal, unguided process. At least here, like, don't we as people of faith have to plant the flag here and say, look.
You mean if we bear the image of God in some way, if that's to be taken seriously? Do you mean
I guess so.
that humanity stands unique from the rest of the animal kingdom in that we are God's image bearers, according to...
I guess so, and I'm not trying to bring up like a whole, like, we don't have to exegete passages or a whole theological thing, but more on it's maybe like the last stand before embracing all of this evolution stuff. Like, now, wait a minute, aren't human beings special? And as a religious person, I want to hold on to that, and I want to know how that relates to what is going on in the science.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's a good question, because when Pew and Gallup and some of these other research organizations, when they survey people, you can find where there is a distinction made between people's acceptance of evolution if you include humans and if you don't include humans. So that is definitely a sticking point for a lot of people. But I would say there is nothing demeaning about evolution. What is demeaning about a natural process? What is demeaning about human beings being brought into existence through a natural process? You know, if people want a child, if a couple wants a child, and they pray to God and ask God to send them a child, and a pregnancy occurs, if they're people of faith, they thank God for the gift of this child and for the miracle of childbirth, full well knowing that to get to this child, we have 9 months of a very natural embryologic process. And no one considers that embryological process to be demeaning. I'll spare you the gory details of how all of us began at one point in our existence.
Right. I was going to say there's some natural things occurring before the embryonic development.
Absolutely. And even before that, if you're talking about gamete production, the production of egg and sperm in the process called meiosis, it is a random party gone wild. If you don't like randomness in your human development, you know, you're not going to get the gametes, because there is all sorts of randomness that goes into creating eggs and sperm. And the fertilization process itself, again, randomness. And just the development from this one single cell that's undifferentiated. All this, as it divides, all the cells are identical. They don't differentiate for quite some time. I will say this, the first opening in your body is not your mouth. It's your other opening. You know, a lot of people don't like to hear things like that. And it's part of the natural embryological process, yet no one finds that demeaning. And so I think we are missing a really, really important conversation. And that is, what does it mean to be God's image bearers? Does that mean that it's a resemblance of some sort? Or is it a vocation or a task of reflecting God into the world? And then can we talk about, does it really matter how we evolved, how we got here, if we are truly fulfilling our vocation of reflecting God into the world? Science doesn't tell us a single thing about our purpose as humans. And that's why I would reject scientism or naturalism, because there are ways of knowing things that are outside of science. And my faith tells me about my purpose as a human. And my faith tells me that God tasked me and other humans with being the image bearers of God into the world. So our function is to reflect God regardless of our material origins. So, I don't mean this to sound crass or anything, but does it really matter if we evolve to have 8 fingers instead of 5, or if we evolve to walk on 4 legs instead of 2, if we are reflecting God into the world? Does it really matter that we evolved to be the way we look identically now? So I think we're missing a important conversation about what it actually means to be God's image bearers, and is a natural process by default, a demeaning process. And I think that's what we've decided, is that evolution is demeaning. Are you saying that we, came from monkeys, that thing which we didn't come from monkeys, but are you saying that we share common ancestry with all life? Yes, we do. And if God is the source of all of that, I want to know, how is that demeaning? How is that demeaning us in any way if we are connected to all of the life that God created? But, kind of to circle back to something that's been a theme throughout our discussion, is that, these decisions to reject evolution do not come from science. They don't come from an examination of the science. It's not the science that is demanding it. It's theology that is demanding it. Todd Wood is a young earth creationist. He has a website, Core Academy, and he caused a lot of consternation in the young creationist world not too long ago when he posted a blog that said evolution is not a theory in crisis. And he went on, but the conclusion of his blog was that no one is hiding evidence for creation. There is evidence for evolution. And then he makes this statement: I reject evolution as a faith choice. So he was honest enough to say so, that his rejection of evolution was a faith choice and not a science choice. And actually, the same thing happened to Galileo. Galileo did not get brought up before the Inquisition because he hurt their science feelings, by saying that the Earth was not the center of the solar system.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
There were other people at the same time of Galileo who were under the rule of the church, who likewise said that it was the sun was the center. But they weren't in trouble with the church. What got Galileo in trouble was trying to make the religion and the science coordinate together. And when he began to talk about how this was not inconsistent with Scripture, that's when he caught the church's attention. And he didn't just say in his science lane, he forayed into theology. And so then it became a big deal, because if the earth is no longer the center of the solar system, then the earth, then humans who live on that earth are no longer the apple of God's eye. And if we are no longer the apple of God's eye, the center of God's attention, then all is lost. Christianity just falls to the ground. Well, we see the same thing in creationist arguments, that if we don't have a literal Genesis, a literal creation, then the Bible is no longer inerrant. We don't have an Adam. If we don't have an Adam, we don't have a fall. We don't have sin. And all of a sudden, there's no need for Jesus. And so if you back it up far enough, it's not the science that underlies the passion behind creationism, intelligent design. It's the theology, this misunderstanding that the theology is going to crumble if we take away this part. The last I read scripture says that there is no other name. And that name is Jesus. That name's not Adam. And I just wonder if the gospel's so fragile that it's going to collapse under a non-literal Adam, a non-literal Genesis.
That's fascinating. That image, the idea of image of God as function as opposed to sort of ontological status. That's,
I'm going to chew on that.
Yeah, that's new to me. That's really interesting. I got to think about that. I had one follow-up question that might be strange and off topic, but my brother asked me today and we were thinking about it. Evolution is not a process that has stopped, right? I mean, what's next? And should we expect biological evolution? Will humans look different in 1,000 years? And my mind immediately went to, well, when I think about the process of evolution and natural selection, it's like organism shaping environment, environment shaping organism, and seems to me like the next frontier is technology and integrating that with us more somehow. But what do you think about going forward? Evolution and humans, will we have wings one day? Who knows? Where are we headed?
Interestingly, to be biologically successful doesn't mean complexity. Bacteria are one of the most biologically successful organisms on our planet, but they're not complex. Humans, on the other hand, are quite complex, and because of our complexity, we have become successful. But also, because of our complexity, we have learned to circumvent many of the outcomes of evolution. Think about disease processes, ways that we, antibiotics, vaccines, all the ways that we evade natural selection. All of the people that 500 years ago would not have survived into early childhood and definitely would not have survived into adulthood. Because of our complexity, because of our big brains, we have circumvented a lot of the natural selection processes in human evolution. So, it's hard to predict at that point, but you're absolutely right. Evolution didn't stop. And that's a misconception too, is to think that we are the apex of everything. Evolution as a process does not have a goal. We're humans, we've got the big brains, we rule the world. So we think that we were the goal of evolution, that's what we were working for all this time. Biologically, you cannot make that point. If you want to talk philosophically or religiously, that's another conversation. But biologically, evolution doesn't have a goal.
Because we could still go extinct easily. Right? Easily. Yeah. Nuke the world, and cockroaches remain, and they're the most successful. I mean, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because on the other hand, our complexity not only gave us antibiotics and vaccines, but it also gave us, climate change and pollution and all sorts of other stuff that we're doing to our environment that would harm us.
Yeah.
Well, as a way of wrapping up, I'd like to just give you a chance to address the audience of what are some practical next steps for people to take. Of course, here, can you reach it there?
Yeah. Here's one practical step: buy this book. Yep. And read it. That'll be good for you. Yeah.
Now this one has some veteran coffee stains on it. I accidentally spilled some at Panera.
That makes it better.
Right, that's battle torn.
That's right.
It's called Baby Dinosaurs on the Ark. I don't know if we've said the name.
Yeah, we did.
We did. Okay,
yeah.
Just in case.
We'll
you
have
forgot.
it in the show notes too. Yep. But this book isn't what changed your mind initially. There are other people that wrote books that helped you change your mind. What are some of those that you would point people to, or resources that could help folks dig into this a little bit more if they're so inclined?
Well, this is actually an older book. It was pretty much the game changer for me. It first came out in 1999, but it was Kenneth Miller's Finding Darwin's God. And he breaks down all of the different iterations of creationism and talks about the intellectual cost of trying to contort yourself into maintaining some of these positions while still maintaining your faith. So there's definitely that. If you're interested in reading more about intelligent design, Miller also has a book about the Kitzmiller trial called Only a Theory. And then, of course, Francis Collins, our wonderful head of the National Institutes of Health, wrote The Language of God. And again, a wonderful book. Probably all three of those books are probably more intense as far as the science goes. Those are wonderful books to read after mine. I would say that. A lot of times, I would say to someone who's just beginning to wonder if there's something to this whole evolution thing, it's not going to be an overnight process. And most likely, you will spend time in transition. You may go through a time where you aren't sure what you believed, but you haven't quite firmed up where you fall in the discussion about origins yet. So, find a way to give yourself a vocabulary, because without the vocabulary, it's hard to know where to start. It's hard to know where to start researching. And of course, there's the wonderful website called Biologos, which was initially begun by Francis Collins. Deb Haarsma is now the president of Biologos, and it just has all sorts of wonderful resources, reading list, homeschooling advice, lots of different resources there. Lots of resources that weren't always there when I first began to investigate on my own. But, from what I found personally, and people that I know that have come along this same path that I have, from being a creationist to someone who feels that they can, as a person of faith, accept the evidence for evolution. At some point, it just becomes intellectually impossible to maintain those contortions. And that's actually where I got the title to my book. If you've got to put baby dinosaurs on the ark in order to make dinosaurs fit into the fossil record, you're going through a lot of mental gymnastics in order to, it's exhausting. And it becomes, it starts to feel intellectually dishonest, especially when we are grateful for all of the advances in modern biology that treat our cancers, or treat the cancers of our loved ones, or new therapeutics for chronic diseases. We thank God for those things, and we're so happy to have them. But the same processes that brought you those new treatments are the exact same processes that say we share common ancestry, and all life on Earth evolved from a common ancestor. And so it becomes intellectually untenable to say that the science is true in this aspect when it helps me, but it's untrue when it talks about the origin of life. It just becomes, the tightrope to walk, that you just can't get that baby dinosaur on the ark anymore. And you're not willing to give up your faith, but you've got to start looking at what the science says. And then, it's not an overnight process, because after you come to accept the science for biology, science of evolution, you've got to then decide what you do with Genesis. And like you said, how you began by reading John Walton. Great place to start.
Well, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on.
This has been great, Janet. Thank you so much.
I loved it. So much fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Yeah. Where can people follow you or follow your work? Do you have a website or a Twitter or something?
I do. I have a blog that's just Janet K. Ray, just my name, JanetKray, JanetKray.com. It's a blog, but I also pull my blog over to my author page on Facebook. I put it both places. So I write about evolution, origins, but I also write a lot about contemporary issues. For example, we're experiencing the fallout of decades of telling Christians they can't trust scientists. And
Right.
Yeah. And what's happening now in our pandemic is we have too many Christians saying they can't trust the scientist. And so it's all related, and that's all fascinating to me. And I love to write about that, all that perfect storm of when science and faith and current events, modern medicine, all just kind of come together in one neat package.
Brilliant. That was janetKray.com.org.
And then just Janet K. Ray on Facebook, my author page.
Brilliant.
Well, thanks for coming, Janet. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, if you're listening to this, you made it. 2-hour talk. We covered a lot of ground, and there was a lot left on the cutting room floor from her book that we could have talked about. Again, yeah, we really encourage you to check out her book, the blog that she mentioned, janetKray.com has all of those resources. And yeah, if you want to support what we're doing, probably the best way is to actually subscribe or follow our blog. We write about that each week, and that would effectively be joining our email list so you can find out updates of new episodes and topics coming up. And we'd love to hear from you. Write into the show at mailbag@opentotruth.com.
Yeah, if you've got questions, you got comments, if something came up in this episode, you by all means write in. And if you have a guest that you think would be dynamite for our show, someone we should reach out to and see if we can get them, we'll try. Even if they're a big name,
happens.
We'll try.
Yeah.
So by all means, let us know. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. So until next time, stay curious.